Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is about self-concept. Again, if you were in class on Monday, you do not need to watch this video, just unless you'd like a refresher. So self-concept refers to the sum total, the entirety of our beliefs that we hold about ourselves, so what people hold about themselves. Self-concept is seen as an internal regulator of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior. So it kind of guides our thoughts, feelings, and ultimately our behavior. Self-concept interprets and organizes our experiences. It is made up of self-schemas, which are beliefs about oneself that guide the processing of information relevant to the self. So some schemas are, and these are just kind of either or verses. Schemas are not necessarily verses. Introverted, extroverted, exciting, dull, quiet, loud, healthy, unhealthy, lazy, active. So in class we used the example of an athlete. So when an athlete of any particular sport practices that sport, they're reinforcing the schema that they are an athlete. Or when they play the game, they're reinforcing the schema. But even things like discussing the game with someone else is reinforcing the schema that they are an athlete. So schemas are basically things that reinforce what we are already thinking about ourselves. If you are aschematic, so I'm not an athlete, I'm aschematic. Watching a game does not make me feel like I'm an athlete. So it is just something that you identify with, and as you kind of build in your knowledge, it just kind of increases. So it's just basically reinforcing the thoughts that you have about yourself. Schemas are basically their beliefs about ourselves that guide the processing of information. Does culture affect our self-concept? It does. So culture, what we do, shapes ourself, and ourself, as we act on that culture, reinforces the culture. So it's just kind of like this cycle. It's how culture is kind of passed down from generation to generation. We are social connectors. So in order to understand our motives, emotions, and behaviors, we must be able to self-reflect. So to have thoughts concerning ourselves. And we must realize that our sense of self, those thoughts, is heavily influenced by social and cultural factors. Another way culture affects your self-concept, remember, some countries are individualistic and some are collectivistic. So the United States is very individualistic, so our priorities are to benefit ourselves. So when we think about going to school, we think about what it is that we would like to do. In collectivist countries, they think in terms of group. So they're not trying to be better than or different than other members of the group. Their goal, rather than to benefit themselves, so they wouldn't go to school to benefit themselves, they would go to school to study something that would benefit the group. So other countries, collectivist countries, people in collectivist countries find their value in groups. So family, teams, business, church, state, that's their belonging. On page 67 in the text, figure 3.4 explains what they term the culture cycle. It's the 4 I's, and so it talks about how individuals are shaped with their interactions with others. So the social aspect, they're shaped by institutes such as the government, religion, even the media, and ideas of what are right, natural, and what's wrong. So kind of like our morals, our moral compass, right? And each of these influence each other to help form our behavior. It's kind of like a never-ending circle. What is the looking glass self? What does that mean? It means that other people serve as a mirror for how we see ourselves. Charles Cooley coined the term looking glass self, while sociologist George Herbert Mead noted that we often come to know ourselves by imagining what significant others think of us and then incorporating these perceptions into our self-concept. So whether right or wrong, whether they really are thinking it or not, what we are imagining they're thinking, we in turn incorporate into our self-concept. So the looking glass self asks, how do I appear to others? What judgments are they making about me? And lastly, depending on if I feel a sense of pride or shame or happiness at those judgments, I am revising my concept of myself. So if I'm feeling shame at the judgments that I'm thinking they're making about me, I am going to reinforce the concept of myself, adding that shame in there. But if I feel pride in thinking whatever judgment I'm thinking they're making about me, that's going to reinforce the thoughts that I already had about myself. Moving on to self-esteem. Self-esteem is simply our positive and negative evaluations of ourselves. Self-esteem is relatively stable throughout life, but it is affected and closely related to self-worth. Our self-worth is greatly affected by things such as successes. So when we're successful, our feelings of self-worth increase. And things like failures, our feelings of self-worth can decrease. Social relationships, life experiences, that all affects our feelings of self-worth. If we have a failure and we look at it as, okay, so this didn't work, but I'm going to try this again, make these adjustments, try it this way, we can take that failure and turn it into kind of like a stepping stone or some learning blocks or whatever. And in doing so, can take that guilt and shame that we might feel, which would decrease our self-worth, and turn it into something that can still increase or have a lesser effect on our self-worth. Our self-esteem is defined by a match between how we see ourselves and how we want to see ourselves. We have our actual selves, which is where we are right now. We have our ought selves, like I ought to be something else. And then there is the ideal self. So if you were to write 3 columns and label them actual, ought, and ideal, your actual, where I am right now. So my ought, maybe you're thinking I ought to already be graduated from college, or I ought to already have a job. And then the ideal would be kind of something like the end goal, right? So when there's a conflict between the actual and the ought, so you're disappointed in yourself that you've not already finished school, which that would be, if you're taking 5, 6, 7 years and you haven't already finished school, you would feel a conflict between where you are right now and where you feel you ought to be. And you would feel guilt, shame, resentment. So your option is to basically do something to kind of bridge that gap, right? So your choices would be finish school, stick with it, or find a way to take away that guilt and shame, which is, could be finding a reason why, okay, so I'm doing this instead, so I don't need to go back to school. Then the conflict between your actual and ideal self is disappointment, frustration, unfulfillment, sadness. That is when there's a conflict between where you are now and, that like the ideal self is like the best, right? And so if you don't see where you can get, how you can get from your actual self to your ideal self, you might feel this frustration, this unfulfillment. You can kind of use the actual, the ought self. Let me fix that. You can use the ought self kind of as stepping stone. So where you are right now, where I ought to be. So use that as a little stepping stone. From there, then you're in your actual self. You have another ought self. So, okay, this is my second move. Each of those moves from actual self, where we are right now, to the ought self, I ought to be, is moving towards that ideal. When we move towards that ideal, we are boosting our self-esteem. We're boosting our self-concept of ourself. If we are privately self-conscious, we have an inner voice that helps us reduce the disparity relative to our own standards. So we either improve or we remove the standard. That is something that is inside of us that gives us that desire to either improve or remove the standard, to kind of like bring back equilibrium in our bodies, right? If we're publicly self-conscious, we try to match our behavior to socially acceptable norms. So our ought self would be due to something that we think is socially acceptable. And that would kind of create a striving between where we are now and where we ought to be. Lastly, do people from collectivist countries feel the same sense or the same need for self-esteem? They do. Their need for self-esteem, though, is wrapped up again in the group. And so where we find our self-esteem in things, taking the stepping stones between the actual and the ought for ourselves, they do the same, but in groups. And so when they are bettering the group, they are boosting their self-esteem. So the need is the same. The mode to boosting your self-esteem is different depending on culture.